This is a continuation of Now It Can Be Told by Philip Gibbs, comprising Part 4, Chapters 15 through 20.
Part 4, Chapter 15. While we hung on the news from Verdun, it seemed as though the fate of the world were in Fort Douaumont. Our own lists of death grew longer. In the casualty clearing station by Popperinghe, more mangled men lay on their stretchers, hobbled to the ambulance trains, groped blindly with one hand clutching at a comrade's arm. More and more and more, with head wounds and body wounds, with trench feet and gas. "Oh Christ," said one of them whom I knew. He had been laid on a swing bed in the ambulance train. "Now you will be comfortable and happy," said the RAMC orderly. The boy groaned again. He was suffering intolerable agony and, grasping a strap, hauled himself up a little with a wet sweat breaking out on his forehead. Another boy came along alone with one hand in a big bandage. He told me that it was smashed to bits and began to cry. Then he smudged the tears away and said, "I'm lucky enough. I saw many fellows killed." So it happened, day by day, but the courage of our men endured. It seemed impossible to newcomers that life could exist at all under the shell fire which the Germans flung over our trenches and which we flung over theirs. So it seemed to the Irish battalions when they held the lines round Loos, by that Hohenzollern redoubt which was one of our little hells. "Things happened," said one of them, which in other times would have been called miracles. We all had hairbreadth escapes from death. For days they were under heavy fire, with 9.2s flinging up volumes of sand and earth, and stones about them. Then waves of poison gas, then trench mortars and bombs. "It seemed like years," said one of the Irish crowd. "None of us expected to come out alive." Yet most of them had the luck to come out alive that time, and over a midday mess in a Flemish farmhouse they had hearty appetites for bully beef and fried potatoes, washed down by thin red wine and strong black coffee. Round Ypres, and up by Bozinghe and Hooge, you remember Hooge, the 14th, 20th, and 6th Divisions took turns in wet ditches and in shell holes, with heavy crumps falling fast and roaring before they burst like devils of hell. On one day there were 300 casualties in one battalion. The German gunfire lengthened, and men were killed on their way out to rest camps to the left of the road between Popperinghe and Vlamertinge. On March 28, the Royal Fusiliers and the Northumberland Fusiliers, the old fighting 5th, captured 600 yards of German trenches near Senauxot and asked for trouble, which, sure enough, came to them who followed them. Their attack was against a German stronghold built of earth and sand bags 9 feet high, above a nest of trenches in the fork of 2 roads from St. Eloi to Messines. They mined beneath this place, and it blew up with a roaring blast which flung up tons of soil in a black mass. Then the Fusiliers dashed forward, flinging bombs through barbed wire and over sandbags which had escaped the radius of the mine, burst in one jumbled mass of human bodies in a hurry to get on, to kill, and to come back. One German machine gun got to work on them. It was knocked out by a bomb flung by an officer who saved his company. The machine gunners were baywented. Elsewhere there was chaos out of which living men came, shaking and moaning. I saw the Royal Fusiliers and Northumberland Fusiliers come back from this exploit, exhausted, caked from head to foot in wet clay. Their steel helmets were covered with sand bagging, their trench waders, their rifles and smoke helmets were all plastered by wet, white earth, and they looked a ragged regiment of scarecrows gathered from the fields of France. Some of them had shawls tied about their helmets, and some of them wore the shiny black helmets of the Jaeger regiment and the grey coats of German soldiers. They had had luck. They had not left many comrades behind, and they had come out with life to the good world. Tired as they were, they came along as though to carnival. They had proved their courage through an ugly job. They had done damn well, as one of them remarked, and they were out of the shell fire which ravaged the ground they had taken, where other men lay. Part 4, Chapter 16. At the beginning of March there was a little affair costing a lot of lives in the neighbourhood of St. Eloi, up in the Ypres salient. It was a struggle for a dirty hillock called the Bluff, which had been held for a long time by the 3 Division under General Haldane, whose men were at last relieved, after weary months in the salient, by the 17th Division commanded by General Pilcher. The Germans took advantage of the change in defence by a sudden attack after the explosion of a mine, and the men of the 17th Division, new to this ground, abandoned a position of some local importance. General Haldane was annoyed. It was ground of which he knew every inch, It was ground which men of his had died to hold. It was very annoying using a feeble word to battalion officers and men of the 3 Division, Suffolk's and King's Own Liverpool's, Gordon's and Royal Scots, who had first come out of the salient, out of its mud and snow and slush and shell fire, to a pretty village far behind the lines on the road to Calais, where they were getting back to a sense of normal life again, sleeping in snug billets, warming their feet at wood fires, listening with enchantment to the silence about them, free from the noise of artillery. They were hugging themselves with the thought of a month of this. Then, because they had been in the salient so long and had held this line so stubbornly, they were ordered back again to recapture the position lost by new men. After a day of field sports, they were having a boxing match in an old barn, very merry and bright, before that news came to them. General Haldane had given me a quiet word about it, and I watched the boxing, and the faces of all those men, crowded round the ring, with pity for the frightful disappointment that was about to fall on them, like a sledge-hammer. I knew some of their officers, Colonel Dyson of the Royal Scots, and Captain Heathcote, who hated the war, and all its ways with a deadly hatred, having seen much slaughter of men and of their own officers. Colonel Dyson was the 17th commanding officer of his battalion, which had been commanded by every officer down to 2nd lieutenant, and had only 30 men left of the original crowd. They had been slain in large numbers in that holding attack by Hooge on September 25th during the Battle of Loos, as I have told. Now they were going in again, and were very sorry for themselves, but hid their feelings from their men. The men were tough and stalwart lads, tanned by the wind and rain of a foul winter, thinned down by the ordeal of those months in the line under daily bouts of fire. In a wooden gallery of the barn, a mass of them lay in deep straw, exchanging caps, whistling, shouting, in high spirits. Not yet did they know the call back to the salient. Then word was passed to them after the boxing finals. That night they had to march 7 miles to entrain for the railroad nearest to Ypres. I saw them march away silently, grimly, bravely, without many curses. They were to recapture the bluff, and early on the morning of March 2d, before dawn had risen, I went out to the salient and watched the bombardment which preceded the attack. There was an incessant tumult of guns, and the noise rolled in waves across the flat country of the salient and echoed back from Kemmel Hill and the White Sheet Ridge. There was a white frost over the fields, and all the battle front was veiled by a mist which clung round the villages and farmsteads behind the lines and made a dense bank of grey fog below the rising ground. This curtain was rent with flashes of light, and little glinting stars burst continually over one spot where the bluff was hidden beyond Zillebeek Lake. When daybreak came, with the rim of a red sun over a clump of trees in the east, the noise of guns increased in spasms of intensity, like a rising storm. Many batteries of heavy artillery were firing salvos. Field guns, widely scattered, concentrated their fire upon one area, where their shells were bursting with a twinkle of light. Somewhere a machine gun was at work with sharp, staccato strokes, like an urgent knocking at the door. High overhead was the song of an airplane coming nearer, with a high, vibrant humming. It was an enemy searching through the mist down below him for any movement of troops or trains. It was the 76th Brigade of the 3 Division, which attacked at 4:32 that morning, and they were the Suffolk's, Gordon's, and King's Own Liverpool's who led the assault, commanded by General Pratt. They flung themselves into the German lines in the wake of a heavy barrage fire, smashing through broken belts of wire and stumbling in and out of shell craters. The Germans, in their front lines, had gone to cover in deep dugouts, which they had built with feverish haste on the bluff and its neighborhood during the previous 10 days and nights. At first only a few men, not more than 100 or so, could be discovered alive. The dead were thick in the maze of trenches, and our men stumbled across them. The living were in a worse state than the dead, dazed by the shell fire and cold with terror when our men sprang upon them in the darkness before dawn. Small parties were collected and passed back as prisoners, marvelously lucky men, if they kept their sanity as well as their lives after all that hell about them. Hours later, when our battalions had stormed their way up other trenches into a salient jutting out of the German line and beyond the boundary of the objective that had been given to them, other living men were found to be still hiding in the depths of other dugouts and could not be induced to come out. Terror kept them in those holes, and they were like wild beasts at bay, still dangerous because they had their bombs and rifles. An ultimatum was shouted down to them by men too busy for persuasive talk. If you don't come out, you'll be blown in. Some of them came out and others were blown to bits. After that, the usual thing happened, the thing that inevitably happened in all these little murderous attacks and counterattacks. The enemy concentrated all its power of artillery on that position captured by our men, and day after day hurled over storms of shrapnel and high explosives, under which our men cowered until many were killed and more wounded. The first attack on the bluff and its recapture cost us 3,000 casualties, and that was only the beginning of a daily toll of life and limbs in that neighborhood of hell. Through driving snowstorms, shells went rushing across that battleground, ceaselessly in those first weeks of March, but the 3D Division repulsed the enemy's repeated attacks in bombing fights, which were very fierce on both sides. I went to General Pilcher's headquarters at Renninghilst on March 4th and found the staff of the 17th Division frosty in their greeting, while General Pratt, the brigadier of the 3D Division, was conducting the attack in their new territory. General Pilcher himself was much shaken. The old gentleman had been at St. Eloi when the bombardment had begun on his men. With Captain Ratnag, his A.D.C., he lay for an hour in a ditch with shells screaming overhead and bursting close. More than once when I talked with him, he raised his head and listened nervously and said, "Do you hear the guns? They are terrible." I was sorry for him, this general who had many theories on war and experimented in light signals, as when one night I stood by his side in a dark field and had a courteous old-fashioned dignity and gentleness of manner. He was a fine old English gentleman and a gallant soldier, but modern warfare was too brutal for him, too brutal for all those who hated its slaughter. Those men of the 3D Division, the Iron Division, as it was called later in the war, remained in a hideous turmoil of wet earth up by the bluff until other men came to relieve them and take over this corner of hell. What remained of the trenches was deep in water and filthy mud, where the bodies of many dead Germans lay under a litter of broken sand bags and in the holes of half-destroyed dugouts. Nothing could be done to make it less horrible. Then the weather changed and became icily cold, with snow and rain. One dugout which had been taken for battalion headquarters was 6 feet long by 4 wide, and here in this waterlogged hole lived 3 officers of the Royal Scots, to whom a day or two before I had wished good luck. The servants lived in the shaft alongside which was a place measuring 4 feet by 4 feet. There were no other dugouts where men could get any shelter from shells or storms, and the enemy's guns were never silent. But the men held on, as most of our men held on, with a resignation to fate and a stoic endurance beyond that ordinary human courage which we seemed to know before the war. The chaplain of this battalion had spent all the long night behind the lines, stoking fires and going round the cookhouses and looking at his wrist watch to see how the minutes were crawling past. He had tea, rum, socks, oil, and food all ready for those who were coming back, and the lighted braziers were glowing red. At the appointed time, the padre went out to meet his friends, pressing forward through the snow and listening for any sound of footsteps through the great hush. But there was no sound except the soft flutter of snowflakes. He strained his eyes for any moving shadows of men, but there was only darkness and the falling snow. 2 hours passed, and they seemed endless to that young chaplain, whose brain was full of frightful apprehensions, so that they were hours of anguish to him. Then at last the first men appeared. "I've never seen anything so splendid and so pitiful," said the man who had been waiting for them. They came along at about a mile an hour, sometimes in groups, sometimes by 2s or 3s, holding on to each other, often one by one. In this order they crept through the ruined villages in the falling snow, which lay thick upon the masses of fallen masonry. There was a profound silence about them, and these snow-covered men were like ghosts walking through cities of death. No man spoke, for the sound of a human voice would have seemed a danger in this great white quietude. They were walking like old men, weak-kneed, and bent under the weight of their packs and rifles. Yet, when the young padre greeted them with a cheery voice that hid the water in his heart, every one had a word and a smile in reply, and made little jests about their drunken footsteps, for they were like drunken men with utter weariness. "What price Charlie Chaplin now, sir?" was one man's joke. The last of those who came back, and there were many who never came back, were some hours later than the first company, having found it hard to crawl along the Via Dolorosa, which led to the good place where the braziers were glowing. It was a heroic episode, for each one of these men was a hero, though his name will never be known in the history of that silent and hidden war. And yet it was an ordinary episode, no degree worse in its hardship than what happened all along the line when there was an attack or counter-attack in foul weather. The marvel of it was that our men, who were very simple men, should have stuck it out with that grandeur of courage which endured all things without self-interest and without emotion. They were unconscious of the virtue that was in them. Part 4, Chapter 17. Going up to the line by Ypres, or Armentières, or Loos, I noticed, in those early months of 1916, an increasing power of artillery on our side of the lines, and a growing intensity of gun fire on both sides. Time was, a year before, when our batteries were scattered thinly behind the lines, and when our gunners had to be thrifty of shells, saving them up anxiously for hours of great need. When the SOS rocket shot up a green light from some battered trench upon which the enemy was concentrating hate. Those were ghastly days for gunner officers who had to answer telephone messages calling for help from battalions whose billets were being shelled to pieces by long-range howitzers, or from engineers whose working parties were being sniped to death by German field guns, or from a brigadier who wanted to know, plaintively, whether the artillery could not deal with a certain gun which was enfilading a certain trench and piling up the casualties. It was hard to say, "Sorry, we've got to go slow with ammunition." That now was ancient history. For some time the fields had grown a new crop of British batteries. Month after month our weight of metal increased, and while the field guns had been multiplying at a great rate, the heavies had been coming out, too, and giving a deeper and more sonorous tone to that swelling chorus which rolled over the battlefields by day and night. There was a larger supply of shells for all those pieces, and no longer the same need for thrift when there was urgent need for artillery support. Retaliation was the order of the day, and if the enemy asked for trouble by any special show of hate, he got it quickly, and with a double dose. Compared with the infantry, the gunners had a chance of life, except in places where, as in the salient, the German observers stared down at them from high ground and saw every gun flash and registered every battery. Going round the salient one day with General Burstall, and a very good name too, who was then the Canadian gunner general, I was horrified at the way in which the enemy had the accurate range of our guns and gun pits and knocked them out with deadly shooting. Here and there our amateur gunners, quick to learn their job, found a good place and were able to camouflage their position for a time and give praise to the little god of luck, until one day sooner or later they were discovered, and a quick move was necessary if they were not caught too soon. So it was with a battery in the open fields beyond Kemmel village, where I went to see a boy who had once been a rising hope of Fleet Street. He was new to his work, and like the adventure of it that was before, his men were blown to bits around him, and he was sent down as a tragic case of shell shock, and as we walked through the village of Kemmel he chatted cheerfully about his work, life, and found it topping. His bright, luminous eyes were undimmed by the scene around him. He walked in a jaunty, boyish way through that ruined place. It was not a pleasant place. Kemmel village, even in those days, had been blown to bits, except where, on the outskirts, the chateau with its racing stables remained untouched. German spies, said the boy, and where a little grotto to Our Lady of Lourdes was also unscathed. The church was battered and broken, and there were enormous shell pits in the churchyard and open vaults where old dead had been tumbled out of their tombs. We walked along a sunken road and then to a barn in open fields. The roof was pierced by shrapnel bullets, which let in the rain on wet days and nights, but it was cosy otherwise in the room above the ladder where the officers had their mess. There were some homemade chairs up there, and Kirchner prints of naked little ladies were tacked up to the beams among the trench maps, and round the fireplace where logs were burning was a canvas screen to let down at night. A gramophone played merry music and gave a homelike touch to this parlour in war. "A good spot," I said. "Is it well hidden?" "As safe as houses," said the captain of the battery. "Touching wood, I mean." There were 6 of us sitting at a wooden plank on trestles, and at those words 5 young men rose with a look of fright on their faces and embraced the beam supporting the roof of the barn. "What's happened?" I asked, not having heard the howl of a shell. "Nothing," said the boy, "except touching wood." The captain spoke too loudly. We went out to the guns, which were to do a little shooting, and found them camouflaged from aerial eyes in the grim desolation of the battlefield, all white after a morning's snowstorm, except where the broken walls of distant farmhouses and the windmills on Kemmel Hill showed black as ink. The gunners could not see their target, which had been given to them through the telephone, but they knew it by the figures giving the angle of fire. "It's a pumping party in a waterlogged trench, said a bright-eyed boy by my side. He was one of the rising hopes of Fleet Street before he became a gunner officer in Flanders. With any luck we shall get him in the neck, and I like to hear the Germans squeal, and my gun's ready first, as usual. The officer commanding shouted through a tin megaphone, and the battery fired, each gun following its brother at a second interval, with the staccato shock of a field piece, which is more painful than the dull roar of a heavy. A word came along the wire from the officer in the observation post a mile away. Another order was called through the tin mouthpiece. Repeat. Ta. We've got M, said the young gentleman by my side, in a cheerful way. The officer with the megaphone looked across and smiled. We may as well give them a salvo. They won't like it a bit. A second or two later there was a tremendous crash as the 4 guns fired together. Repeat, came the high voice through the megaphone. The still air was rent again. In a waterlogged trench, which we could not see, a German pumping party had been blown to bits. The artillery officers took turns in the observation posts, sleeping for the night in one of the dugouts behind the front trench instead of in the billet below. The way to the observation post was sometimes a little vague, especially in frost and tall weather, when parts of the communication trenches slithered down under the weight of sandbags. The young officer who walked with luminous eyes and eager step found it necessary to crawl on his stomach before he reached his lookout station from which he looked straight across the enemy's trenches. But once there it was pretty comfortable and safe, barring a direct hit from above or a little mining operation underneath. He made a seat of a well-filled sandbag. It was rather a shock when he turned it over one day to get dry side up and found a dead Frenchman there and smoked Belgian cigars for the sake of their aroma and sat there very solitary and watchful. The rats worried him a little. They were bold enough to bare their teeth when they met him down a trench, and there was one big fellow called Cuthbert who romped round his dugout and actually bit his ear one night. But these inconveniences did not seem to give any real distress to the soul of youth, out there alone and searching for human targets to kill, until one day, as I have said, everything snapped in him and the boy was broken. It was on the way back from Kemmel village one day that I met a queer apparition through a heavy snowstorm. It was a French civilian in evening dress, boiled shirt, white tie, and all with a bowler hat bent to the storm. Tomlinson, the great Tomlinson, was with me and shook his head. It isn't true, he said. I don't believe it. We're mad. That's all. The whole world is mad, so why should we be sane? We stared after the man who went into the ruin of Kemmel, to the noise of gunfire, in evening dress, without an overcoat, through a blizzard of snow. A little farther down the road we passed a signboard on the edge of a cratered field. New words had been painted on it in good Roman letters. Cimetière Reserve. Tomlinson, the only Tomlinson, regarded it gravely and turned to me with a world of meaning in his eyes. Then he tapped his forehead and laughed. Mad, he said. We're all mad. Part 4. Chapter 18. In that winter of discontent there was one great body of splendid men whose spirits had sunk to zero, seeing no hope ahead of them in that warfare of trenches and barbed wire. The cavalry believed they were bunkered forever, and that all their training and tradition were made futile by the digging in of armies. Now and again, when the infantry was hard pressed, as in the second Battle of Ypres and the Battle of Loos, they were called on to leave their horses behind and take a turn in the trenches, and then they came back again, less some of their comrades, into dirty billets remote from the fighting lines, to exercise their horses and curse the war. Before they went into the line in February of 16, I went to see some of those cavalry officers to wish them good luck, and saw them in the trenches, and afterward when they came out. In the headquarters of a squadron of royals the way in was by a ladder through the window, billeted in a village which on a day of frost looked as quaint and pretty as a Christmas card, was a party of officers typical of the British cavalry as a whole. A few pictures cut out of La Vie Parisienne were tacked onto the walls to remind them of the arts and graces of an older mode of life, and to keep them human by the sight of a pretty face. Oh, to see a pretty girl again. Now, they were going to change this cottage for the trenches, this quiet village with a church bell chiming every hour, for the tumult in the battlefront, this absolute safety for the immediate menace of death. They knew already the beastliness of life in trenches. They had no illusions about glory, but they were glad to go, because activity was better than inactivity, and because the risk would give them back their pride, and because the cavalry should fight anyhow and somehow, even if a charge or a pursuit were denied them. They had a hot time in the trenches. The enemy's artillery was active, and the list of casualties began to tote up. A good officer and a fine fellow was killed almost at the outset, and men were horribly wounded. But all those troopers showed a cool courage. Things looked bad for a few minutes when a section of trenches was blown in, isolating one platoon from another. A sergeant major made his way back from the damaged section, and a young officer who was going forward to find out the extent of damage met him on the way. "Can I get through?" asked the officer. "I've got through," was the answer, "but it's chancing one's luck." The officer chanced his luck, but did not expect to come back alive. Afterward, he tried to analyze his feelings for my benefit. "I had no sense of fear," he said, "but a sort of subconscious knowledge that the odds were against me if I went on, and yet a conscious determination to go on at all costs and find out what had happened." He came back, covered with blood, but unwounded. In spite of all the unpleasant sights in a crumpled trench, he had the heart to smile when in the middle of the night one of the sergeants approached him with an amiable suggestion. "Don't you think it would be a good time, sir, to make a slight attack upon the enemy?" There was something in those words, a slight attack, which is irresistibly comic to any of us who know the conditions of modern trench war, but they were not spoken in jest. So the cavalry did its bit again, though not as cavalry, and I saw some of them when they came back, and they were glad to have gone through that bloody business so that no man might fling a scornful word as they passed with their horses. "It is queer," said my friend, "how we go from this place of peace to the battlefield, and then come back for a spell before going up again. It is like passing from one life to another." In that cavalry mess I heard queer conversations. Those officers belonged to the old families of England, the old caste of aristocracy, but the foul outrage of the war, the outrage against all ideals of civilization had made them think, some of them for the first time, about the structure of social life and of the human family. They hated Germany as the direct cause of war, but they looked deeper than that, and saw how the leaders of all great nations in Europe had maintained the philosophy of forms, and had built up hatreds and fears, and alliances over the heads of the peoples whom they inflamed with passion or duped with lies. "The politicians are the guilty ones," said one cavalry officer. "I am all for revolution after this bloody massacre. I would hang all politicians, diplomats, and so-called statesmen with strict impartiality." "I'm for the people," said another. "The poor, bloody people, who are kept in ignorance, and then driven into the shambles when their rulers desire to grab some new part of the earth's surface or to get their armies going because they are bored with peace." "What price Christianity?" asked another, inevitably. "What have the churches done to stop war or preach the gospel of Christ? The Bishop of London, the Archbishop of Canterbury, all those conventional, patriotic, canon-blessing, banner-baptizing humbugs. God, they make me tired." Strange words to hear in a cavalry mess. Strange turmoil in the souls of men. They were the same words I had heard from London boys in Ypres, spoken just as crudely. But many young gentlemen who spoke those words have already forgotten them or would deny them. Part 4, Chapter 19. The winter of 1915 to 1916 passed with its misery, and spring came again to France, and Flanders with its promise of life, fulfilled in the beauty of wild flowers and the green of leaves where the earth was not made barren by the fire of war and all trees killed. For men there was no promise of life, but only new preparations for death and continued killing. The Battle of Verdun was still going on, and France had saved herself from a mortal blow at the heart by a desperate, heroic resistance which cost her 550,000 in dead and wounded. On the British front there were still no great battles, but those trench raids, artillery duels, mine fighting, and small massacres which filled the casualty clearing stations with the average amount of human wreckage. The British armies were being held in leash for a great offensive in the summer. New divisions were learning the lessons of the old divisions, and here and there generals were doing a little fancy work to keep things merry and bright. So it was when some mines were exploded under the German earthworks on the lower slopes of the Vimy Ridge, where the enemy had already blown several mines and taken possession of their craters. It was to gain those craters, and new ones to be made by our mine charges, that the 74th Brigade of the 25th Division, a body of Lancashire men, the 9th Loyal North Lancashires, and the 11th Royal Fusiliers, with a company of Royal Engineers and some Welsh pioneers, were detailed for the perilous adventure of driving in the mine shafts, putting tremendous charges of high explosives in the sapheads, and rushing the German positions. It was on the evening of May 15th, after 2 days of wet and cloudy weather, preventing the enemy's observation, that our heavy artillery fired a short number of rounds to send the Germans into their dugouts. A few minutes later, the right group of mines exploded with a terrific roar and blew in 2 of the 5 old German craters. After the long rumble of heaving earth had been stilled, there was just time enough to hear the staccato of a German machine gun. Then there was a second roar, and a wild upheaval of soil when the left group of mines destroyed 2 more of the German craters and knocked out the machine gun. The moment for the infantry attack had come, and the men were ready. The first to get away were 2 lieutenants of the 9th Loyal North Lancashires, who rushed forward with their assaulting parties to the remaining crater on the extreme left, which had not been blown up. With little opposition from dazed and terror-stricken Germans, bayonetted as they scrambled out of the chaotic earth, our men flung themselves into those smoking pits and were followed immediately by working parties who built up bombing posts with earth and sand bags on the crater lip and began to dig out communication trenches leading to them. The assaulting parties of the Lancashire Fusiliers were away at the first signal and were attacking the other groups of craters under heavy fire. The Germans were shaken with terror because the explosion of the mines had killed and wounded a large number of them, and through the darkness there rang out the cheers of masses of men who were out for blood. Through the darkness there now glowed a scarlet light, flooding all the turmoil of earth and men with a vivid, red illumination as flare after flare rose high into the sky from several points of the German line. Later the red lights died down, and then other rockets were fired, giving a green light to this scene of war. The German gunners were now at work in answer to those beacons of distress, and with every caliber of gun from howitzers to Minenwerfers they shelled our front lines for 2 hours and killed for vengeance. They were too late to stop the advance of the assaulting troops, who were fighting in the craters against groups of German bombers who tried to force their way up to the rescue of a position already lost. One of our officers leading the assault on one of the craters on the right was killed very quickly, but his men were not checked, and with individual resolution and initiative and the grit of the Lancashire man in a tight place, fought on grimly and won their purpose. A young lieutenant fell dead from a bullet wound after he had directed his men to their posts from the lip of a new mine crater, as coolly as though he were a master of ceremonies in a Lancashire ballroom. Another, a champion bomb thrower, with a range of 40 yards, flung his hand grenades at the enemy with untiring skill and with a fierce contempt of death until he was killed by an answering shot. The N.C.O. took up the command, and the men carried on until they held all the chain of craters, crouching and panting above mangled men. They were hours of anguish for many Germans, who lay wounded and half buried, or quite buried, in the chaos of earth made by those mine craters now doubly upheaved. Their screams and moans sounding above the guns, the frantic cries of men maddened under tons of earth, which kept them prisoners in deep pits below the crater lips, and awful inarticulate noises of human pain coming out of that lower darkness beyond the light of the rockets, made up a chorus of agony more than our men could endure, even in the heat of battle. They shouted across to the German grenadiers, "We will cease fire if you will, and let you get in your wounded, cease fire for the wounded." The shout was repeated, and our bombers held their hands, still waiting for an answer. But the answer was a new storm of bombs, and the fighting went on, and the moaning of the men who were helpless and unhelped. Working parties followed up the assault to consolidate the position. They did amazing things, toiling in the darkness under abominable shell fire, and by daylight had built communication trenches with head cover from the crater lips to our front-line trenches. But now it was the enemy's turn, the turn of his guns, which poured explosive fire into those pits, churning up the earth again, mixing it with new flesh and blood, and carving up his own dead, and it was the turn of his bombers, who followed this fire in strong assaults upon the Lancashire lads, who, lying among their killed and wounded, had to repel those fierce attacks. On May 17th, I went to see General Doran of the 25th Division, an optimistic old gentleman who took a bright view of things, and Colonel Crosby, who was acting brigadier of the 74th Brigade, which had made the attack. T, too, was enthusiastic about the situation, though his brigade had suffered 800 casualties in a month of routine warfare. In my simple way, I asked him a direct question. "Do you think your men can hold on to the craters, sir?" Colonel Crosby stared at me sternly. "Certainly. The position cannot be retaken over ground. We hold it strongly." As he spoke, an orderly came into his billet, a small farmhouse, saluted, and handed him a pink slip, which was a telephone message. I watched him read it, and saw the sudden pallor of his face, and noticed how the room shook with the constant reverberation of distant gun fire. A big bombardment was in progress over Vimy Way. "Excuse me," said the colonel. "Things seem to be happening. I must go at once." He went through the window, leaping the sill, and a look of bad tidings went with him. His men had been blown out of the craters. A staff officer sat in the brigade office, and when the acting brigadier had gone, raised his head and looked across to me. "I am a critic of these affairs," he said. "They seem to me too expensive, but I'm here to do what I am told." We did not regain the Vimy craters until a year afterward, when the Canadians and Scottish captured all the Vimy Ridge in a great assault. Part 4, Chapter 20. The winter of discontent had passed. Summer had come with a wealth of beauty in the fields of France this side the belt of blasted earth. The grass was a tapestry of flowers, and tits and warblers and the golden oriole were making music in the woods. At dusk, the nightingale sang, as though no war were near its love, and at broad noonday 1,000,000 larks rose above the tall wheat with a great high chorus of glad notes. Among the British armies there was hope again, immense faith that believed once more in an ending to the war. Verdun had been saved. The enemy had been slaughtered. His reserves were thin and hard to get, so said intelligence, and the British, stronger than they had ever been in men and guns and shells and aircraft and all material of war, were going to be launched in a great offensive. No more trench warfare, no more dying in ditches. Out into the open with an army of pursuit, Rawlinson's, and a quick breakthrough. It was to be the great push. The last battles were to be fought before the year died again, though many men would die before that time. Up in the salient, something happened to make men question the weakness of the enemy, but the news did not spread very far, and there was a lot to do elsewhere, on the Somme, where the salient seemed a long way off. It was the Canadians to whom it happened, and it was an ugly thing. On June 2nd, a flame of fire from many batteries opened upon their lines in Sanctuary Wood and Maple Copse, beyond the lines of Ypres, and tragedy befell them. I went to see those who lived through it, and stood in the presence of men who had escaped from the very pits of that hell, which had been invented by human beings out of the earth's chemistry, and yet had kept their reason. The enemy's bombardment began suddenly with one great crash of guns at 8:30 on Friday morning. Generals Mercer and Williams had gone up to inspect the trenches at 6 o'clock in the morning. It had been almost silent along the lines when the enemy's batteries opened fire with one enormous thunderstroke, which was followed by continuous salvos. The shells came from nearly every point of the compass, north, east, and south. The evil spell of the salient was over our men again. In the trenches just south of Huge were the Princess Patricia's Light Infantry, with some battalions of the Royal Canadian Regiment south of them, and some of the Canadian Mounted Rifles, who had long been dismounted, and units from another Canadian division at the extreme end of their line of front. It was those men who had to suffer the tempest of the enemy's shells. Earth below them opened up into great craters as high explosive shells burst continually, flinging up masses of soil, flattening out breastworks and scattering sandbags into dust. Canadians in the front trenches held on in the midst of this uproar. "They took it all," said one of the officers, and in that phrase, spoken simply by a man who was there, too, lies the spirit of pride and sacrifice. They took it all, and did not budge, though the sky seemed to be opening above them, and the earth below them. The bombardment continued without a pause for 5 hours, by which time most of our front trenches had been annihilated. At about 1:15, the enemy's guns lifted a little, and through the dense smoke clouds which made a solid bar, across no man's land, appeared a mass of German infantry. They wore their packs and full field kit, as though they had come to stay. Perhaps they expected that no one lived in the British trenches, and it was a reasonable idea, but wrong. There were brave men remaining there, alive and determined to fight. Although the order for retirement had been given, single figures here and there were seen to get over the broken parapets and go forward to meet the enemy halfway. They died to a man, fighting. It seemed to me one of the most pitiful and heroic things of this war. That little crowd of men, many of them wounded, some of them dazed and deaf, stumbling forward to their certain death to oppose the enemy's advance. From the network of trenches behind, not altogether smashed, there was time for men to retire to a second line of defense, if they were still unwounded and had strength to go. An officer, Captain Crossman, in command of one of these support companies, brought several men out of a trench, but did not follow on. He turned again, facing the enemy, and was last seen a big, husky man, says one of his comrades as he fired his revolver and then flung it into a German's face. Colonel Shaw of the 1st Battalion, CMR, rallied 80 men out of the Cumberland dugouts and died fighting. The Germans were kept at bay for some time, but they flung their bombs into the square of men, so that very few remained alive. When only 8 were still fighting among the bodies of their comrades, these tattered and blood-splashed men, standing there fiercely contemptuous of the enemy and death, were ordered to retire by Major Palmer, the last officer among them. Meanwhile, the battalions in support were holding firm in spite of the shell fire, which raged above them also, and it was against this second line of Canadians that the German infantry came up and broke. In the center, the German thrust was hard toward Zillebeek Lake. Here some of the Canadian rifles were in support, and as soon as the infantry attack began, they were ordered forward to meet and check the enemy. An officer in command of one of their battalions afterward told me that he led his men across country to Maple Copse under such a fire as he had never seen. Because of the comrades in front, in dire need of help, no notice was taken as the wounded fell, but the others pressed on as fast as they could go. Maple Copse was reached, and here the men halted and awaited the enemy with another battalion who were already holding this wood of 6 or 7 acres. When the German troops arrived, they may have expected to meet no great resistance. They met a withering fire, which caused them bloody losses. The Canadians had assembled at various points which became strongholds of defense with machine guns and bomb stores, and the men held their fire until the enemy was within close range, so that they worked havoc among them. But the German guns never ceased, and many Canadians fell. Colonel E. H. Baker, a member of the Canadian Parliament, fell with a piece of shell in his lung. Hour after hour, our gunners fed the breaches and poured out shells. The edge of the salient was swept with fire, and though the Canadian losses were frightful, the Germans suffered also, so that the battlefield was one great shambles. Our own wounded, who were brought back, owe their lives to the stretcher-bearers, who were supreme in devotion. They worked in and out across the shell-swept ground hour after hour through the day and night, rescuing many stricken men at a great cost in life to themselves. Out of one party of 20, only 5 remained alive. No one can say, said one of their officers, that the Canadians do not know how to die. No one would deny that. Out of 3,000 men in the Canadian 8th Brigade, their casualties were 2,200. There were 151 survivors from the 1st Battalion Canadian Mounted Rifles, 130 from the 4th Battalion, 350 from the 5th, 520 from the 2nd. Those are the figures of massacre. 11 days later, the Canadians took their revenge. Their own guns were but a small part of the huge orchestra of heavies and field batteries which played the devil's tattoo upon the German positions in our old trenches. It was annihilating, and the German soldiers had to endure the same experience as their guns had given to Canadian troops on the same ground. Trenches already battered were smashed again. The earth, which was ploughed with shells in their own attack, was flung up again by our shells. It was hell again for poor human wretches. The Canadian troops charged at 2 o'clock in the morning. Their attack was directed to the part of the line from the southern end of Sanctuary Wood to Mount Gorst, about a mile, which included Armagh Wood, Observatory Hill, and Mount Gorst itself. The attack went quickly, and the men expected greater trouble. The enemy's shell fire was heavy, but the Canadians got through under cover of their own guns, which had lengthened their fuses a little, and continued an intense bombardment behind the enemy's first line. The men advanced in open order and worked downward and southward into their old positions. In one place of attack, about 40 Germans, who fought desperately, were killed almost to a man, just as Colonel Shaw had died on June 2d, when his party of 80 men who had rallied round him. It was one shambles for another, and the Germans were not less brave, it seems. 1 officer and 113 men surrendered. The officer was glad to escape from the death to which he had resigned himself when our bombardment began. "I knew how it would be," he said. "We had orders to take this ground and took it, but we knew you would come back again. You had to do so, so here I am." Parts of the line were deserted, except by the dead. In one place, the stores which had been buried by the Canadians before they left were still there, untouched by the enemy. Our bombardment had made it impossible for his troops to consolidate their position and to hold the line steady. They had just taken cover in the old bits of trench, in shell holes and craters, and behind scattered sandbags, and had been pounded there. The Canadians were back again.
This concludes the 10th part of 18 total of Now It Can Be Told by Philip Gibbs, produced by Best Audiobooks for free.